see all the. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you for everything that we could learn today, Marisa. And thank you for inviting me. I think what is for me really a nice is to hear the importance and commitment to food safety and to producing a safe food product. So my name is Ryk Lewis. I work in Central University of Technology in the Free State. And we've been working on food safety for some time, but specifically focusing on food safety culture, which is a new emerging concept in industry. And it's also kind of the new kid on the block, so much so that it's been incorporated into much of the legislation and the standards. And we're going to go into that a little bit and also link up with what the other speakers have said in terms of organizational culture and also leadership. So what is the basic question? Why do we have to look into food safety culture? We've got legislation, we have all our systems, we've got our auditors coming in, we've got our certification systems, our testing. But why do we still get food-related outbreaks? You've heard what Gerard said earlier about that in the US, that CEO of the company that's been held liable, ending up in jail. Why does all of this happen? Do all of this happen if we have got everything in place? And the reason is there's a missing link. And the missing link is, of course, the food handler. Every person working in the facility handling food every day, and that is the individual that keeps all the compliance systems together. The reason is that no standard and no compliance system and no process can pick up every non-conformance. We've seen what the previous speaker said about the organisms lurking there in the corners. Doesn't matter how much we try and clean, we can improve, but we can never do everything. And that is where the human factor comes in. That person that is loyal to your organization, that is committed, that picks up something from the floor, that reports something smelling, or something that can be a risk to consumer. And that is what food safety culture is about. We've seen, ladies and gentlemen, a lot in the past that the food safety sector is very, very regulated. There is standards and systems and processes and testing and evaluation and risks and models and all of these to assist us to ensure safe food. But sometimes if we do this too much, it can actually be negative for our food safety culture, because nobody, no worker, very few people actually comes to work just for the sake of compliance. We actually want to come to work to enjoy what we do, to enjoy what we're interested in, not just to comply and do more and more regulations and processes. So there's been a lot of work being done by previous researchers showing actually, and one of them is Herzberg, that company policy and administration, all these rules and regulations is actually one of the biggest demotivators in the workplace. And isn't this interesting that we just increase systems, policies, processes, and what we actually do is in the process demotivating our staff instead of motivating them. So what will, at the end of the day, what we trying to achieve with a positive culture is to change people's behaviors in the food safety sector and food safety workplace. And the culture is just the one there in yellow. There are many other determinants of behavior, also emotion, need, personality, experience, knowledge, environment. All of these influence your organizational culture and how committed you are. But the one that we've used most of the times is consequence, meaning that if you do something wrong, you will be penalized or there will be an implication, which is not a very positive behavioral change mechanism because it doesn't motivate, it just moves you to do certain things. And that's why we're focusing on culture, because culture is also easily or easier to change. You cannot easily change people's, for example, emotional personality. How do you do that? But you can change the organizational culture. So organizational culture change in the food safety sector is all about changing people's behavior through a positive culture. And we're seeing a lot the effectiveness of this in strong food sports teams, where the sports team and the competency of the players and the environment stays more or less the same, but there's a new coach, there's a new team spirit, and then they start performing. A very good way of explaining this is the example of JFK and the janitor, and please read up a little bit more about that. What actually happened is that JFK, when he visited Kennedy Space Center in the 60s, there was a cleaner, janitor. He asked the cleaner, "What are you doing?" Expecting probably to hear the guy saying, "I'm cleaning the floor," or this is my portfolio. But the guy said, "Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon." So in terms of food safety, if we do this effectively in every food premises that we go into, whether it is dairy, whether it is meat, whether it is processed foods, whether it is wholesale and retail, whether it is primary production, if you ask somebody there that's a food handler, what is his or her role? The answer must be, or should be, I'm working together with my organization to produce safe and wholesome foods to our customers. That is somebody that buys into the organizational culture. And when you compare the strength of culture with the strength of your other strategies in your organization, culture is claimed to be stronger than strategies. And there's been a lot of publications about this. Peter Drucker is one of them, that says even if your strategy falls a bit short, if you've got a good culture, things will get better, because the culture overperforms when it comes to strategy. It eats strategy for breakfast, which just shows you the strengths of this component compared to all your systems and processes. Please read a little bit about Frank Janas. He's a well-known publisher in the field and authority in food safety culture, worked for very important companies, was actually the main responsible person for QC and safety in Walmart, in Disney, FDA, and he's a big advocate of food safety culture. And there's a few quotes from him. This one just says, this food safety culture is how people think about food safety. What is their attitudes? Will they openly discuss food safety and the emphasis that they place on food safety, which is, I think, very important. Please, if you have a time, have a look at some of his publications. More formally, Chris Griffith kind of put this in publications, and Griffith and Jesperson and Wallace, there's a few people working on this in the field in higher education, clearly demonstrated. It says food safety performance at the bottom is not just your systems and processes. It actually also aligns with that red square, which is your food safety culture. And that he breaks down into issues of leadership, communication, commitment, environment, and risk. So again, very clearly authoritative publications on the role of culture to ensure performance. Of course, over the last 10 years, 15 years, food safety culture, together with other claims being put on the role of organizational culture in performance, have also been taken up in legislation and standards. BRCGS got a component of that that's being audited nowadays. Food Safety FSCC 22000 6.1 has got a component that needs to be audited, GFSI and many of them. So even in terms of your compliance aspect, it's now being enforced to be a component that you need to look at during audits. Almost the same as ethical audits is being more and more implicated. It's the same with food safety culture. So this is not just a nice to have anymore. It is now a requirement. Gerard talked a lot about the consequence for the organization and the consequence for leadership in terms of food safety. And often leadership, CEOs and managers don't want to see this, because this is for them just a compliance issue. They want to make money, they want to see their organization grow, and kudos to them, because they are responsible for the sustainability of the jobs in that organization. But they need to understand, and we had at earlier presentations, we had questions to this effect. How do you get their buy-in? And I think the two important things for them, for leadership, is to firstly understand the risk for them the risk in terms of reputation, but also in person, if it is like under the US system where there's liability and legal responsibility for the CEO. And then secondly, also understanding that it's good for the funding and the bottom line, because managers want to see money coming in, but leadership wants to see financial sustainability. So just very briefly, Consumer Protection Acts in South Africa, and I think in many other countries, there's a proven cause, then you're liable, and there's an alleged cause where there's a balance of probabilities. Meaning if there's two, there's a likelihood that somebody got sick or got there's a risk being done or harm to one of your customers. And then they look at the broader context in terms of litigation, where the organizational culture then starts playing a role, where the litigation will say, what is the likelihood that this place was badly managed, there was poor leadership, and therefore probably also poor systems. Also literature about the bottom line. A positive organizational culture produces a positive bottom line and positive financial sustainability. It has been shown, a lot of literature, don't take my word for it, even in food safety culture aspect, because food safety culture feeds into the organizational culture and feeds into a culture of performance, commitment, and diligence. So that if that doesn't convince your leadership, it will be very difficult to convince them. Let's look quickly at, now that we understand food safety culture in the workplace. Now that was the why. Let's look at the what and the how quickly, just to conclude. So there's a lot of organizational culture stuff out there that you can find on the internet. People saying, yeah, it's all about team spirit. Are we motivated? Let's just all go for it. But it's in the food industry that's so complex, the farm to fork continuum. You need to be very careful and very committed to make sure that you don't use a one-size-fits-all approach. The reason is that if you make assumptions on an organizational culture that is wrong or skewed, it can actually be quite a demotivator in the workplace. And that is why we as a university at our research center is very clear about the fact that you don't just use generalist assumptions, but you must measure this, and you must then impose or suggest clear interventions that's targeted on that specific environment. Very briefly, in case of organizational culture, the measurement of that culture uses social science methodologies, focus groups, interviews, observations, surveys, even a look at some of the QC systems. And all of that feeds into getting a good picture of what the organizational culture is. What is also important is that this culture is different in different sections at the organization. So you cannot just measure a processing line and say that is the organizational culture. There are different organizational cultures in huge organizations. We did a lot of studies, for example, where we worked with a big organization in South Africa that had different outlets in different provinces. And the difference between the organizational culture amongst the provinces was astounding. If we then made a common assumption that the whole organization is the same, we would have made a lot of harm, done more harm than good, actually. I want to say something about leadership, and you've seen, I mentioned a lot of constructs that plays into organizational culture. You talk about systems, processes, empowerment. You talk about is people really, how are they treated? Do they feel safe in that environment? Are they loyal? Are they trustworthy? But I want to specifically mention leadership. And the reason why I'm pointing out leadership is because it's probably the biggest contributor to either a good or a bad organizational culture. And we always we have bad examples, but let's not use that today. I've got good examples of, for example, the maple leaf listeriosis outbreak about 15 years ago, where the way that CEO handled it was really, really a good example. And maybe it was also, like Gerard mentioned, the fact that in Canada, where this happened, the CEO is held personally liable. So he realized that he need to step up to the plate. Otherwise, he's going to be kept personally liable. In South Africa, I don't think personal liability is still in the law, but in the US and definitely in Canada, it is in the law. And he said at this outbreak, he said the following, he said, there are some advisors that I've paid no attention to. Those are the lawyers and the accountants. And what did he mean by this? He meant by this that it's not about the legal or the money issues now for him. People are dying, that his customers, his company is going through, an organization is going through a different time. His staff members are unsure about their future. And he's now going to focus on that aspect, an aspect of leadership, of empathy, of standing in and just have leadership traits like ethics and trustworthiness. And he also took responsibility. And we had a lot of discussions about that also previously, and I think Gerard also referred to this. And maybe the colleagues that's in this webinar listen says often if there's implication, it's being referred just to the section that works with it, which is often the QC section or the section responsible for quality assurance and safety. So the QC manager is held liable, while the management and the senior people didn't want to buy in. So this guy from Maple Leaf, he said, I take responsibility. The buck stops with me. I'm going to support my organization in this case rather than trying to defect a responsibility, which is what we want from leadership, which is, I think, something that we need to take note of. A little bit more into structure and processes. How do we go through the process? Should you be involved in an organization that's looking to do a process and to correct this and look into this? This is more or less the steps that we follow. First, we look at what is the status quo. In other words, we just measure it. We see what's happening. We can also call it a gap analysis, so that we can understand what's currently happening. Thirdly, in the middle, we then start implementing interventions that's targeted and responsive to what we tested. And then once we start looking into this and things pick up, then we celebrate those and we try and sustain and improve that further with other interventions. And at the end of the day, we retain this good organizational culture. And then it's not all about compliance, but so many other of a ripple effect that's positive to the organization. Usually what some of these systems entail that's currently being used, we also use systems like this, is online surveys, targeted interviews, one-on-one discussions, focus groups, also on-site visits, because if you go for an on-site assessment, you actually get a very good intuitive feel about the organizational culture there. And then, of course, what we said, it needs to be representative sample so that you don't just make a general assumption. And then a few other pointers that's important of this data collection tools. There's ethics around that, which we do not usually as microbiologists need to worry about. People need to know that it's voluntary, that it is anonymous. They won't be afterwards, there won't be implication for them. Otherwise, they're not going to be sincere. And it must be done at different aspects, on supervisory level, on the shop floor level, and different ways. And the data must be representative. What is important in our country, for example, is the languages sometimes that you use. Our country is very culture driven, and that you also make sure that you are sensitive to the language and cultural barriers that there may be. The results of such a survey can be shown in many different ways. This is just some of the tools that we use. We use descriptive statistics that clearly shows where the shortfalls are. If you just show them nice and visibly, you can see that yellow arrow there, just clearly this was different sections in an organization. We had the maturity score, you can immediately see the section where there's issues with regard to a certain construct. In this case, it was team spirit, and we could hone specifically into that section. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, what we call is a maturity model. That goes a bit further so that the entire organization can be benchmarked to say, where are we now and where will we be next year, Are we still evolving, or are we already excellent? In conclusions, ladies and gentlemen, let me just recap the phases currently, and these are also the phases that's been evaluated by most of the assessment systems and the auditing. What phases will they be looking at if you want to comply? Usually the first phase that they are looking for in terms of evidence is, were there introductory awareness skills, were there organizational buy-in, overarching background training and interventions to get a involvement and an awareness around food safety culture. Then assessment processes that will entail actually honing in and doing specific surveys in whatever sections or regions they may require. Then the alignment part, which is very, very important, and that is why you really need to align your intervention or your solution very clearly with your finding. If it's, for example, something about leadership, something about resources, maybe something about communication, your intervention must be targeted to address that shortfall. And then phases, that is phase 4, and then phase 5 and 6 is just your second and third party auditing. Hopefully when you get to the third party auditing, they will say, kudos, you are good, and let's maintain this good organizational culture. Ladies and gentlemen, Marisa, baie dankie. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for presenting. And yes, and that's my 10 cents, and handing over back to you. Thanks.